Welcome to Mapping the Self. I'm Selena Garofino. Know thyself was carved into stone at the entrance to Apollo's temple at Delphi in ancient Greece. Scholars, philosophers, and civilizations have debated the questions of what it is to know yourself for thousands of years. I invite you to join me for conversations with artists, creators, scholars, writers of all walks of life to debate and discuss the big questions of what it is to live a wonderful human life, to map ourselves, to know ourselves, to grow our compassion and our listening, and explore our greatest possibilities. Welcome. Welcome back to Mapping the Self. I am super honored today to be hosting Michaela Boehm. I have had the opportunity to study with Michaela. I completed her nonlinear movement method training as well as her Wild Women's Circle training after reading her beautiful book, The Wild Women's Way, which was just released in paperback this year. Michaela is a counselor with over 30,000 hours of training and clinical experience in trauma and addiction. She has created groundbreaking work in somatic research and practices. She's worked with Will Smith and Gwyneth Paltrow. She most recently was on a Netflix series called Unwell. We could go on and on about your biography, but I'll just put a link to it in the show notes because there's so much I could say about you. Thank you for being here, Michaela. Intimacy coach. We could be here for 30 minutes with your bio.
Hello.
I tried to listen to as many episodes as I could of podcast interviews with you because I don't want to just repeat all the content that is already out there, which is also difficult because you're such a prolific speaker. One of the things I wanted to start with to just dive into and ask you, and it's a question I ask everyone because the title of the show is Mapping the Self. And so we're really having dialogues about what the self is and how we get to know ourselves. And is there such a thing as self-mastery? And with your experience, I would love to hear from your perspective what it is for someone to know themselves, because we have all these yoga dialogue, right, about the self being the sublime. And then we have all these personal development coaching programs that are about getting to know your personal desires. And I think we can get lost in the weeds a bit in this conversation and end up feeling more lost. So I would love you to speak on that.
It's an interesting question because you kind of looked at some of the different ways it's looked at, meaning self-mastery or self-development. And then, of course, there's other people who go get rid of the self, transcend the self. So it's I think, interesting idea to decide for ourselves what the self is and how we actually work with it. I tend to, for myself, look at different layers of that, both in my work and in the way I regard it for myself. And one is that, of course, we have to create a persona and a self and an ability to navigate in the world. There's all this talk about transcending the ego and letting go of the self or optimizing the self. But when we really look at it in a much more practical, in the world way, we have to individuate and we have to gather skills and patterns and habits and all kinds of things so that we can function appropriately and hopefully joyously.
Yes.
And I think that's really important to say because a lot of people try to bypass proper personal development, not personal development as in going to another workshop where you will do the thing, when you come home and then you don't, but proper self-development in the context of growing up from, let's say, the unformed blob that we are as an infant or pre-infancy to a functioning, happy, fulfilled human who can give their gifts. That's a whole trajectory of developing a self that I would think is a very positive thing. I don't want to go into the spiritual thing yet, but what that means is we are born, we develop in our mother's uterus where we pick up all kinds of information as far as our mother's breathing pattern, for instance, what kind of neurotransmitters run through her system, how she's disposed to life, all of those kind of things. And from there, we come into the world, and that moment of leaving our mother, right, is the first moment of separation, so to speak. And then from there, there's more and more individuation in the sense that we realize that we're a separate human, that we can learn things, that we can affect things with our behavior, that we are affected by other people's behaviors. There's an entire realm of imprinting and learning and patterning and experiencing that has both the keys to incredible thriving and, of course, also the pitfalls of incredible trauma, depending on what happens, both externally to us and internally in our perception. There's a lot happening there in these first formative years. Right now, the pop psychology discussion du jour is attachment patterns, right? I mean, there's always something. Everybody's a narcissist and everybody is anxiously attached. So there's these trends in what people focus on. Everybody has trauma all the time. And of course, all of that's true, but it's much more intricate than one lens only. It's not only how we attach, but it's also how we perceive that attachment. It's who we are and how much freedom we are given, or if we're given too much freedom, how we have to cope with that. So there's multiple layers of imprints that essentially at some point make us into a person. And that person has a self, so to speak, that has been created. That person has a persona that has been created that then takes the cues from the environment, because we're relational beings, and forms itself as appropriate or as needed. Typically, it's both, right? You have to cope on one end and you have to grow and have desires and thrive towards something, or strive to thrive at least towards something. So then we come to this point where we are now adults, and in an ideal world, we are functioning in the world and we have some aspects of us that we are happy about and fulfilled. And then at that point, typically, we'll get a look at the things that don't work. Meaning, most people don't sit around and they go, wow, I'm really well adjusted. The fact that I have 3 meals a day and work out is amazing. That's typically not what people do. People go, there's this one area where I'm just not good. Or maybe there's lots of areas that are not good. So that whole improving the self often gets boiled down to having shortcomings or not having optimized one's environment. But the problem with that, of course, is if you fundamentally believe that who you are is wrong, or there's something faulty with you, or you need to fix something, you're already coming from the kind of lack and the kind of lack of abundance that makes you fall prey to people who market accordingly, market towards your pain points, as they say so lovely, and that kind of tell you that you can learn things to become better, versus people who say to you, you are who you are, and that's pretty damn good, but there are some skills you're lacking. You don't know how to do this yet. So why don't you learn some skills? Or in the case of the body, right, you know this from your work, instead of going, well, you're just not good, or you're not a yogi, or you're not embodied, go, let me show you how to work with what you got better. Let me show you how to practice. Let me show you how to engage. And so to me, the working on the self is on one end, the honest taking stock of where there's areas that we haven't grown up fully, which are typically a few areas. Most people are developed more in some areas than in others. And so the key to polishing the self or the working on oneself should be as simple as going, I got good skills here, my skills lack here. I feel like I've achieved a lot here, but I don't know how to handle that over here. And so now let me learn the things or grow up the small parts of me that still need some parenting or developing or mothering or whatever you want to say there, so that all parts of you are give or take the same age.
Yes. There's so many things you touched on there that are so important. I'm so glad that you've highlighted individuation. I'm exhausted by the spiritual circles telling us to get rid of ourselves, not have an ego. I joke to my yoga students all the time, if you are missing an ego, you're going to end up in a rubber room, because we have to be able to distinguish ourselves from other beings. And for someone who's been through a lot of trauma recovery, when you don't have good individuation, you end up blending with other people in unhealthy ways.
Correct. And you end up blending with your spiritual teachers in unhealthy ways.
Yes.
you end up blending with the people who tell you to get rid of your ego so that theirs can be fed. And there's a lot of that. And it's very difficult because we have such a strong orientation towards spirit in each of us in our own way that often it seems like that's the answer or the bypass to the things that really have to do with proper human development. And I do think that becoming a decent human being is the prerequisite for all else, unless you live alone in the cave and nobody cares if you're an asshole. You know? Then it's
Yes.
fine. You let go of your ego. You no longer eat. You live off little rolled pills of herbs and nobody is upset with you being maladjusted and smelly.
Yeah. I just love your orientation with being maladjusted. See, and I love your approach because I also come from a tantric lineage where we're not trying to escape what it is to be a human being or to escape the beauty of life. Like we say, life is a gift to be celebrated, not a problem to be solved. And I feel a lot of modern spiritual teaching and what I see on Instagram is about correction and escaping the world, trying to get away from what it is to be a human being. And there's some deep shame in that of trying to always self-correct. And I feel that my personal development and growth really shifted when I quit coming at myself as a problem or as something damaged. And instead it was just over here, I'm missing a technique. Like you said, it's like this technique could be bolstered. And if the technique was better, I would be safer and more effective because where we have technique, we can be more imaginative. When you are first learning to play an instrument, it's very clunky and you have to focus on every key you hit because the technique is missing. But once the technique is there and the competency is there, you can put flavor in it and you can daydream while you play the Chopin. And I feel like that's kind of what happens personally when we develop technique and competency. And I like that you spoke about that.
It's really important to name that as well. And also name the difference between going to a workshop or doing a practice in order to fill out a dent, so to speak, in your wholeness versus becoming somebody else that is irretrievably broken. So with that all said, when we look at the self in that context, right, then looking at areas where you are still young in your development. So you had something happen when you were 5 that still makes you be dependent on your mother, whatever, right? Like all these things we all have where we've just stunted certain aspects of us, growing those up, learning skill, learning technique, gaining insight, super important. Then, of course, we could look at the self in a totally different way and more look at the self as the, let's say, the exalted part of our being that has a gift that needs to be given so that your life has meaning and purpose. So we could look at it in that context. There's beautiful stories and metaphors in all traditions about the soul receiving its purpose, so to speak, and that being brought into the world to find that purpose again, because you forget it as you come in, right? That's the consensus in all these different traditions, is you have a purpose, you lose the purpose coming into your life, and then your job is to find that gift and then give it fully so that you are not just somebody who takes. To me, that's the more spiritual aspect of it, which once again does not mean you should be, like you said, not having an ego would mean being in a rubber room.
It's a bit dramatic.
Yeah, it's dramatic, but it's definitely true for most people. But when we look at somebody like Ramana Maharshi, for instance, who is considered one of those people who really was exalted in a certain way. Yeah, but he had to have his mother come and pick the maggots out of his skin and feed him, right? And he needed an entire team of people to fulfill the functions that he was no longer interested in. And that worked in the context of his society, his attainment, his teaching. But it doesn't work for most people who come to a yoga class or go once a year to a Buddhist retreat or a Vipassana retreat, whatever it is. Most people can't let go of the executive functions as fully as we all maybe might want to. Also, not everybody's gift or purpose is to inspire people through their attainment. I don't think that's universally true. There will be lots of people who will take offense to this, but I don't think everyone's deepest purpose is to be enlightened and sit around in that attainment. I think there's many ways to enlighten one's activity towards service and towards expansion and towards giving the gift that you were meant to give. And different people pursue it differently. And I think there's different ways to go at it. But should you be able in your lifetime to explore what is the most worthwhile and valuable gift you can give? Yes, that's a developing of the self that I think is worthwhile pursuing.
I agree. Dr. Martin Shaw, the mythologist, myth teller, he has this line in his book, The Spyglass, where he's speaking about that he thinks one of the illnesses of the modern age is that you can be anything you want, because it pulls people away from the pursuit of their purpose. And he says, in the old stories say that's not true. They say that you were crafted for something very specific. And I read that and it stopped me in my tracks, because I grew up in a generation where we were told you can be anything you want. And I think we can get lost in that. It's the research that's been done on when there's too many genes to choose from and the dissatisfaction that comes from too many choices. And in some ways, I think that you can be anything you want. It can kind of pull us off track from purpose. And for me, I go back and forth around what's lasting happiness. And I don't know at this point in my life if I think we're meant to be happy all the time, but I do think we're meant to be fulfilled and purposeful. And those are different things. So I'd love to hear from you. And of course, no one has an ultimate answer to this, but what do you think are some keys for people towards gravitating or navigating towards their personal purpose?
I would agree with you and Martin Shaw, who I really think is amazing, by the way.
Me too.
I think there's somebody who is giving his gift as fully as it's possible for him. And there is something true about that in the context of, I want to say a few things about that, because I think it's important to distinguish between having proper choice as a means of being able to fulfill your potential and having too much choice and being sidetracked. And I want to say that when we look at what is possible for us now, let's say as women, let's just talk about that. What's possible for us now as women in 2022 versus what was possible for my mother in 1950. My mother was born in 1941. So let's say by 1955, she would make decisions around her career or her self-expression or things like that. The option she didn't have certainly narrowed her ability to give her gifts within a very specific domain. And I know for my mother, for instance, who is intensely creative and a real artist in her domain, but that wasn't on the books. That wasn't even something that could be pursued. So she poured that creative gift into something that was much more domestic than I think she would have done if she would have had options, which she didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think that being able to say, I can do whatever I want with my life within the context of I can go have a job or stay home and raise my children. I can be an artist or create amazing meals for parties I throw at my home, right? Having more option is better, particularly if you are in the contingent that wasn't always given the freedom that we would like.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point.
I think that's an important point because we do want to be able to have that. But as to Martin Shaw's point, a little bit drilled down, then, of course, there is a certain kind of, and I think we see this a lot. I see this a lot in my work, both with groups and also individuals. Then we come to the point of unrealistic expectation of what we can actually do with our lives and getting sidetracked into some sidearms, some eddies in the stream based on what's presented to us or what we think we should be doing. That's totally contrary to our, let's say, deepest gift in life. And with things like Instagram and social media and YouTube influencers and all the stuff we have there, we could say, well, some people are giving their deepest gift in this new slice of expression. And some people not only are not giving their deepest gift, they're also detracting from other people's ability to express their deepest gift by selling them snake oil of all different kinds. And there he's very, very true that this whole you can be everything can be really, really messing somebody up who hasn't formed themselves properly and can't distinguish between fake marketing and real marketing, fake need to be this and real opportunity to be this and all of that. So it's a difficult time and it's a difficult place. But here is something that everybody can consider, which is your gift or your deepest expression is already there. What I mean by that is when you look at your life, the things you're already doing, giving you a clue to what you're about. Most people don't want to hear that. Most people don't want to hear that the life they're actually leading is the life they're supposed to have, because that's the life you have. And in the life you're leading is the clue to your greatness already. It might not be polished, it might not be expressed, but it's there. And so when you really examine what you are already doing every day, in there lies the clue to what you're capable of, what you're meant to do, and where you could bring your attention to.
I agree. And I also feel, and you can tell me what you think about this, I feel that our deep desires are an indication as well. I like to look up etymology of words, and the root of desire is of the stars. I love that kind of metaphor of something being fated by the stars. So I feel that when I look at my deep desires that have been consistent, not those like impulse desires, but the consistent desires that I've had since I was young, that those are a real key to purpose and fulfillment.
I agree. Totally.
That kind of leads me to my next question. You speak about intimacy a lot. Obviously, you're an intimacy coach, and not just sexual intimacy, but intimacy with ourselves, intimacy through embodiment. And I discovered just this last weekend during a yoga teacher training that when I asked what intimacy was, blank faces stared back at me. And then I got some very interesting definitions. And so I had it on my mind to ask you to define for us in your work what you think intimacy is, intimacy with ourselves, with others, because it's difficult to cultivate if it becomes a catchphrase that doesn't have meaning for us. Like, oh, I'm getting intimate with myself. What does that mean? So I would love to have you speak on intimacy a little bit.
Right. Yeah, it's all of these things like intimacy, embodiment, all of those things. We're supposed to know what they mean. And of course, different people mean different things, all of that. How I would define it for the work both Steve and I are doing individually and together. Well, I won't speak for him, but the work we do together and the work that I do individually, there's a certain aspect to intimacy that has to do with being actually able to feel and track and understand and face whatever there is to be seen and felt and whatever arises. So present moment, ideally, understanding and willingness to turn towards reality, whatever, how you want to say that, your physical sensations in that moment, your emotions in that moment, your thoughts in that moment. And Steve often talks about intimacy not really having informed consent. You probably heard him talk about that in a teacher training.
Yes, I was going to bring that up, so you did it for me.
Yes, meaning you don't know what you find when you actually become intimate with yourself. And that's one of the reasons why we don't always become intimate with ourselves or someone else, because our perception and our fairy tale version of ourselves, our lives, somebody else's persona or their lives is such that it often doesn't match up with what you can feel or see. And that, of course, is a hugely confronting issue. And then, of course, as you know, we've all had that happen. Often when we first really connect with ourselves, the first things that pop up are our traumas or are our injuries or are the things we haven't looked at. And they're often very unpleasant. And so then we go, well, we don't want to feel that. And then of course, you can bypass that any which way by going the spiritual route or the food route or the drug route or the Netflix route or the shopping route or whatever. That's essentially where intimacy starts, is the honest, unvarnished ruthless ability to feel whatever there is to be felt within ourselves. And then, of course, in somebody else. And that's not for the faint of heart.
You just touched on something really important, which is the connection to an unwillingness to be intimate and our addiction patterns that show up in so many different ways. And I like that you roped in some of things that are perceived as negative along with things that are perceived as positive, because we often ignore that there are addictive avoidant behaviors that involve doing things that on paper are nice, like yoga.
Yeah, for instance, exactly.
Like spiritual retreats. Yeah, for instance, totally. I mean, I was someone who didn't realize how much trauma I had and was a yoga teacher for a long time and a deeply feeling person. And so I thought, because I was a deeply feeling person and had good relationships, that I had intimacy with myself. And then when the Pandora's box of trauma therapy and EMDR started, which was at the same time that I first started training with you, all hell broke loose, as you know, for me for several months. It was very dark and very difficult. And now, though, because I was willing to sit in that, I'm so grateful. And now that's not a scary place, that intimacy, because once you face it, those dogs of doom, I love that line from Kay Tempest's poem, the dogs that came to bite you with their bloody snouts are bringing you your slippers in time. They become the little puppy dogs bringing you your slippers, but you have to like get in their face first and let it rise. It's such a gift. And that's why I think the work that you do is such a gift, and these offerings that you've trained so many teachers, because that intimacy. And in time, some of those addictive behaviors fall away on their own. I'm not saying that that's true for everyone. Lots of people need addiction counseling. For me, those certain negative behaviors just fell off. The more I was doing my nonlinear movement practice and going through trauma therapy, they fell away on their own.
Yes. Well, that's the other good thing when we talk about the mapping and polishing and growing the self, right? There's a whole aspect within embodiment and within, let's say, finding ourselves, where we can rely on our body and our systems, our nervous system, our endocrine system, to actually take care of us. And we don't have to white knuckle everything with our head. We have different systems, emotional systems, physical systems, nervous systems that will support us. And like you said, when you give the body the chance to contribute, the body can release things. Emotions can change. The mind can look at things differently. We're not doomed, like you were saying, but you have to look at it. That cold, hard look at what's nipping at your heels and turning towards it, there's no way around that. And that's why it's not for the faint of heart, but there is no way around doing that. And then, interestingly enough, when we then come to the transcending the self, which whatever, but when we look at that, what we're really looking at is not believing our own stories, not enforcing our way of being in everyone else, or forcing everyone else to be in our way of being, inflicting our undigested and unexamined crap on other people, calling it our truth, right? That's the transcending of the aspects of the self that we can do and actually become a gift to others, right? Because when you are able to go, this is probably my shit, and I probably should go move my body and journal and call my therapist before I open my mouth, or things like that, then you become valuable as a player in intimacy amongst people, right? Because you deal with your own stuff, they can deal with their stuff, and then you come together and you can see the other person for who they are without having to have them conform to your undigested stuff.
Yes, or hearing. One of the big revelations I had in the last year at 40 years old was that I'm hearing what people say through the lens of what it would mean if I said it, not necessarily what they mean. And now my favorite question is, can you tell me what you meant by that? Because this is what I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. Instead of assuming, because so often I would hear something someone said and I'm like, well, if I said that, it would mean this. If you have a bunch of shit, you're going to put a negative spin on things that aren't necessarily negative.
Yeah. To other people. Exactly.
It's big. To other people. Yeah. And then it's damaging and there's less joy all around. And I feel that one of the big things I've learned from you is that intimacy is the start of everything. It's like the foundation of all of these other things. You can't grow if there's no foundation of intimacy there.
Yeah. Definitely. And that's the thing, right? The intimacy with oneself allows us to be truly intimate with somebody else because we're not just projecting our shit on things and people. And also we can see somebody fresh because we're not already commodifying or cannibalizing them for our own means, so to speak, which happens a lot when we talk about sexual or relational intimacy, that people are looked at as a means of feeding the holes that we still have. And that's unfortunately what happens in a lot of early work when you start working in couples, let's say dynamics, is that you have to learn for yourself, where are you commodifying your partner so that you feel good about yourself or that they fit into your view of yourself versus how it really is. And all of those kind of things that can be quite difficult. It's not all fun and games.
It's not. And we do the same thing with spiritual teachers, with new practices, because when the hole isn't filled, we move on to the next yoga method or the next person and we disparage the old one. Well, they didn't have the answer, and move from one lineage to the next and one practice to the next. Now I'm a Vipassana meditator. Now I'm this. Now I'm that. That doesn't work. Now I have a new crystal. And it's endless. It's like that constant yearning is there. And I know for me as a teacher, a big revelation I just had recently is certain people, I'll feel very triggered by certain students. And my therapist and I uncovered it's often when it's someone that I feel is pulling on me in that way, wanting me to be the answer for something. And I revolt kind of internally very quickly. A wall comes down because I'm not going to be your God and I'm not going to sit on the throne of your heart. As a yoga teacher or like the work you do, it's because people are seeking. Often, I think they put teachers on pedestals as non-human, and it's very dangerous for the student and for the teacher. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Like, how as teachers, people offering practices that are so powerful for people, what are some tools for people offering practices and coaching and stuff to keep some of that at bay? I mean, I have some answers I've learned, but I'd love to hear from you. It's a big one, I know.
It's a big one, and it's one fraught with, it's so insidious simply because we are all human. And I'm pausing here because I want to be very clear that even though I'm doing my very best and you're doing your very best, we assume most people want to do their best when they teach people. There is some people out there who are very clearly saying, I saw something this morning on Instagram. This is the one vice I still have. I have disconnected from all other social media, but I still like Instagram, visually. And so I saw something on there where I could say, oh, this person is following this teacher's template for course marketing. The way the email was written, the way it's presented, the way the website looked, everything in there was, this is somebody who took a very expensive course on how to be an expert by a person who says that they can teach you how to be an expert, who is not an expert and who is speaking to the pain point in the thing and whatever, right? So there is some people like that who I think are essentially setting themselves up to some real pain, because when you set yourself up to be that person who has the answers and who takes the money of the person who suffers from the thing, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get caught in what I'm describing in a moment, right? Because you're setting out to profit on people's pain. But I would say most people don't set out to profit from people's pain. Most people have a genuine impulse to support people in healing, in growing, in getting the skills that they want, or they subscribe to what we talked about earlier, which is they do think they and other people are broken and it can be fixed. I always love when the first two sentences in the bio say, I once X, whatever, had an eating disorder, was super anxious, didn't make money, couldn't bend in half or whatever, right? Like fill in the shortcoming. And now I have the 6-figure income, the perfect yoga body, whatever, right? So most people, even if they do that, come from a place of genuinely wanting people to get better, misguided or not, right? So I'm saying this to say we can assume most people don't get into the business of being a teacher with bad intentions.
Right.
That said, we are all human, and the more we need other people. This brings us back to intimacy, right? The more we draw authority, connection, validation from how other people see us, the more in danger we are of putting ourselves on a throne or pedestal, simply because on that throne, all your unmet needs get met for a moment before, of course, it goes disastrous, right? When you draw your authority from other people liking you, when you draw your self-worth from people buying your products, when you draw your inspiration from people doing what you say they should do, you're going to put yourself in a position where you are dependent on those people. And as you just said, those people will move on to the next teacher and the next crystal and the next, because what they're hungering actually is somebody who doesn't use them for their own means. They will go from person to person to person till somebody stops cannibalizing them for their own purposes and puts the boundary down. And then they have a choice between either biting into that with all the mess that that might cause, or skipping back out to the next snake oil salesman or the next guru who's willing to engage with that thing for whatever reason.
And whatever price.
And for whatever price. And sometimes the price is very, very high, not only financial. But like you said, there are some things that are written in the stars and some things we have to live out so that we can grow. But if you're a teacher and you want to do good with your students, the best thing you can do is not draw your validation, your self-esteem, and also your dating pool from your students as much as possible, because it makes you corruptible in a certain way, right? It's one thing to offer intimacy, meaning the willingness to be with somebody who they are. It's another one to require intimacy or adoration or whatever, so you can feel okay. That whole thing where you feel that people project their stuff on you is very dicey, because sometimes, as you have experienced, and I certainly have experienced, you see it coming, you know it's going to happen, there's nothing you can do about it, and it's intensely painful. And there is something so brutal about that moment when you realize you have been put on the pedestal. It doesn't matter what you do. It's now going to take the course it takes, which is you're going to enjoy that moment of the pedestal as a reprieve before you're pushed off the pedestal and the projections start and the stuff starts. And of course, if you're not aware of that happening, you can't serve your student by staying with them while they figure that out, because it's just too painful or too dangerous, or you're not well equipped. The best thing you can do as a teacher is do as much personal work on understanding those dynamics in your students and in ourselves. And then at the same time, gaining skill and gaining understanding that allows us to move people through that phase, and also gaining the kind of boundaries so that when it becomes dangerous for us or the student, we can set the proper boundary. And I think that's the best we can do. And sometimes we do better than other times. And sometimes it's not just the pedestal, it's that they appeal to some part of you that needs to be grown, or some parental pattern, or you're just a bit weak. Weak, when I'm talking weak, is you're depleted. You didn't catch it. You had other things going on. You were sick and it kind of didn't register that a dynamic formed, and now you feel weird about it. And it's pretty weird at that point, when you come to.
I think as seekers too, we have to be responsible for our personal internal security so that we don't fall prey to those cult dynamics, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing that when you were starting to ask that question that I was very aware of, is that these cult dynamics, they can be very apparent, right? But they can become more and more and more subtle. And it's really, you have to check yourself all the time, because there's also such fine slices, right? Because sometimes we talk about this in the teacher training, imitate, assimilate, innovate, right? So sometimes people need to imitate in order to kind of individuate and then grow from there. But sometimes people just have a lack of boundaries and they're codependent and the way they imitate you, the way they form a cult around you doesn't lead to growth. It leads to destruction. And sometimes, though, a little bit of good, healthy resonance to grow somebody up might be appropriate. But how do you tell the difference? And sometimes you don't make it cultish, but people unbeknownst to you make it cultish, meaning they form these ideas of how they should behave when they come into the room with you. And you might look at that. I remember a very specific moment in my teacher development where I noticed certain patterns around dressing and behavior, and I thought it was odd. But in my mind, let's see if I can articulate this. In my mind, letting those people do that thing was a way of them developing themselves beyond a certain point. And then I realized that they actually thought I wanted them to behave like that. But I thought it was really weird and odd. It was like around dressing and eating certain foods and stuff like that. But they thought somehow, through some means of whatever, projection or me having said something in jest, or I can't remember the details. That was one way to show dedication or something like that. And there was this real moment in time where that could have gone really wrong. And at some point, because I'm so twitchy when it comes to people doing certain things, I asked, and then that turned out, and then that finally dismantled that whole thing that if I would have not caught would have been a problem. So I wasn't trying to actively stoke some kind of cult behavior, but my hands-off approach could have caused that, right? But it could have also been that I do want certain things, and then people conform against their better judgment, and then we end up in a situation. So where we're going, I think we probably need to move on from here because it's so super.
Yeah, it's
we
so
could get
deep.
stuck here. It's so deep.
It's a big conversation.
But coming back to what you started with, I think as teachers, having supervision is important in the context of other people who see us for who we are and not for who we think we are or who we think we need to be in order to be effective teachers. And I'm, of course, super lucky there because I have Steve who has no problem saying to me, you're a little bit off base, or why are you doing this? Or what happened there, and hopefully the other way around as well.
I think you just spoke to something with having Steve. I think it's important for me. A big key as a teacher is I have people that I trust, like you just said, to be accountable to. I think if you're in any kind of leadership role, you need to have people you're accountable to and to keep you in check.
Yes.
And have those honest conversations. Because if you're a lone wolf out there, you're not going to know. And it's the nature of deception to not know you're deceived. So if there's no one there to probe a little bit, I think we set ourselves and our students up for risk. So I know it's a big topic, but I think you nailed a few things on the head that are very critical. And I'm glad that you keep mentioning the predatory and frankly abusive marketing that is so popular in the coaching industry and stuff now. It's gaslighting. They're trying to trigger people's nervous systems to get them to buy from a spike in adrenaline. And like you said, if you're marketing to pain points, then you're setting yourself up as savior.
Yes.
So I'm glad that you've been throughout this talk mentioning that kind of marketing. For me, it's a red flag. As a student, I would never buy something from a coach that was speaking to a pain point.
Exactly. And you and I both know all the ways that these things are done. But of course, when you are actually in pain, that's not as easy to extricate yourself. We've all done it in some way or another. I ended up the other day, this is a minor example of it, but I had to laugh so hard. I had some weird stuff going out of alignment with my jaw and nothing worked. I ended up with a bunch of whatever tools, neck rolls and whatever that I would have never bought if I didn't have pain in my jaw, because I was like, I need to get to the bottom of this. I need to find something that adjusts that thing. And my still point inducer wasn't doing it and chiropractor wasn't doing it. So I ended up with two different thingies that, not extremely expensive, but that were marketed to people who had neck pain. And that's an important lesson right there when we talk about how do you not fall prey to a teacher who might not be the right teacher is you might want to explore many options and also first look at your existing resources before you jump into yet another thing that fixes it. It's not as easy, of course, when you're in the middle of pain.
No, it's not.
It's a big topic.
It is. And I appreciate you being willing to speak on it. And we'll just put the caveat in there for anyone that we know that was not as nuanced as it could be and that we didn't touch on every single aspect of it, and not to take anything we said as letter of the law. It's just a dialogue.
Right. And also to say that, of course, neither you nor I are infallible there.
No.
We're humans, and sometimes something slips and sometimes you're less developed than you want to be. But that is why having friends and therapists and ongoing education and ongoing reflection is so important, because that way we can catch things and that way we can also learn and apply ourselves. And when I think of myself as a teacher 10, 15 years ago versus a teacher now, I'm a very, very different human, very different teacher. And therein lies also a lesson, which is that we do need to grow and we do need to discard things. And we do need to be willing to let go of beliefs we held and openly say so, and be able to say, yes, I believed that and I taught that because that was the best cutting edge offering I had at that moment. But now, 15 years later, research has shown that there is more to this, or I have realized by having applied it myself and to my clients, this isn't all there is, or this isn't the place to go anymore, right? Because a lot of these things are developmental. And what worked 10 years ago in the zeitgeist, so to speak, and in the climate we were, is not appropriate anymore for a number of reasons. And being able to put things down, move on from them, develop further, grow, accept that you did what you did back then with the best of intention, but not getting dug in on old belief systems simply because they made you money or they gave you adoration or whatever. I think that's also very important.
It's huge. I listened to something from Clarissa Pinkola Estes recently, and she was saying that the crone knows when to let things die.
Yes.
And is willing to put the last nail in the coffin and to kill things off and let them die to make space for something else. And that is a huge thing, especially because other people sometimes get angry about it. I remember about a year ago, I wrote something that was completely opposite of something I had written a year before because I changed my mind. And I said in this, I changed my mind. Here's what the research shows. And a couple people were really angry with me. And the comments were like, well, that's not what you were teaching. And it meant a lot to me when you said that old thing, which was really interesting for me as a teacher, because I was like, well, it's okay if it still speaks to you. It doesn't speak to me anymore.
Exactly.
Even though it doesn't speak to me anymore, it can still mean something for you. But they were really angry that I had changed my mind.
Yeah. Well, that is why a lot of people don't change their minds, because they found the niche, that niche works. That's what they know. They might also not have a lot of extra knowledge, or when people become experts in one field, they typically just dig in there. Not always, but sometimes. So it's definitely brings us back to how do we become the humans that actually gift something to the world. I think the best you can do is be the human that you would want to engage with outside of you. And for me, definitely that's somebody who is able to grow and develop and change for the benefit of the output and the benefit of the beings receiving that output. All once again with the caveat that we sometimes fail disastrously and sometimes we achieve gloriously and everything in between, because that's unfortunately the human experience.
It is. They say in my lineage that Kali promises us every experience from revelry to rage and everything in between. You've spoken without speaking about it. So I'm just going to highlight it though. One of the reasons I study with you and so appreciate you is because you're very honest about being a fallible human. And I think that's one of the keys to look for in teachers and coaches is people that aren't pretending to have it all together and can admit fault and failure and stumbling points and things that they've changed or things they're working on. My eyes narrow a bit when I meet teachers now that everything's too perfect. And you've always been, as a teacher, in my experience, very upfront about being a human being.
Yeah, well, as much as I can. There's, of course, areas where I have blind spots, and there's also areas where I'm very private because they're just for me. I think it's important, and I think it's also a good point when we look at what to look for in a teacher and also what to avoid in being a teacher is I don't think everything needs to be public domain. I do think every human
Agreed.
being has a right to have things that they hold close to their heart or close to their sleeve in the context of areas that are sacred, also areas that are painful, and areas that are still in development or that are only available at certain times to certain people in certain situations. So I don't think we must disclose everything. I also don't think that we have to admit to every fault we've ever had. But I think it's useful to go, I'm as human as you are, and I might have better skills in this domain, and I will give you my skills or I will teach you here, but do not for one moment expect me to fulfill the idea of your pedestal.
Yes, I think that's all so important. I tell yoga teachers all the time to have practices they don't teach. Because if you teach every single thing that you do privately, then there's nothing to fill your tank anymore. Or even in one of our trainings that I did with you, I remember someone asked for a certain song and you were like, no, that one's mine. I'm not going to give you the name of the song. That one's private to me. And I so appreciated it because I'm the same way. I have music that's my public music and I have music that's for my personal nonlinear movement practice that I don't share. And I have breath practices I don't teach publicly because they're mine, and kriyas that are mine. And I don't share them because I need that sacred space internally. And so I do think that's also a very valuable point that you brought up.
Yes, I think that's super, super important. And this is, by the way, also true in partnership, right? If you have an intimate partner, or erotic partner, or a life partner, whatever, you don't share everything. That sacredness makes it so you stay interesting to your partner. It also makes it so you don't sell yourself out or blend too much or enter into some codependent stuff or any of that. And furthermore, the cannibalizing of one's own experience, which is such a dangerous thing to do, there's a huge price to pay. And you see this often, once again, what do you look for in a teacher, right? There is people who essentially use their relationship as a selling point in their coaching practice or in their marriage counseling practice. But that's such a dangerous thing to do because it's somebody else involved. And even if you are the perfect practitioner and you think you have the perfect marriage skills, your partner might have something totally different going on that has nothing to do with you and your aptness in relationship, where they need to leave because they want something else out of their lives, or you are no longer it. And then you have commodified your relationship and you've sold the most sacred part of your life out for a bit of marketing. And now everybody goes, well, look at this person. They just got divorced. Well, yes, because there's two people involved. And when two people involved, there's a wild card. It doesn't have anything to do with how good your relational skills are. That's one slice of a very big pie that you've now sold out for what? And that's the same with your private yoga practice. Just so that you can prove that you are a great yogini, you have now given away the thing that sustains you.
Yeah, and in the minute it's commodified, it loses some of the juice. That was very good. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I've been trying to keep the episodes about an hour because I feel like most people don't have attention. I don't know how people listen to these 3-hour podcasts. We can just do this again in a few months.
It's funny that you say that because I don't have that attention span either, except when I'm in the sauna. Then I like these long form podcasts. Yeah, but some people do those.
Yeah, because it's a story.
Yes. When I'm not in the sauna, it has to be short.
I like to keep them about an hour.
Well, thank you.
I will put in the show notes links to Michaela's website and her book and her podcast. She has a beautiful podcast with Steve James, her teaching partner. And he also has a phenomenal podcast. I need to get Steve on here next, actually. That would be wonderful. I'll send him a message. Thank you so much, Michaela. I really appreciate you being here and for sharing all of your wisdom with us.